Jason DePerro, thank you so much for joining this episode of Global Design Talk by btrax.
So wonderful to be here, John.
Awesome. I mean, we're just looking deep into each other's eyes. I'm excited about this.
Well, normally it's on Zoom. I mean,
that is
ever since you moved away, it just hasn't been the same.
Yes. And now it's this in-person action.
Yeah.
It's good to be back.
It's good to be back.
All right. Well, we invited you today, partially because you're a great designer, just in general. But also, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about your passion around sustainable design and how you got from where you started to where you are now. So,
yeah, thanks. I mean, I've always had a passion for sustainability, and I think part of that journey has really been trying to figure out, like, is it more about my passion for design or sustainability? And I've never really seen that difference. And certainly, certain projects and topics lend themselves more to thinking about, what is the resource use of creating something, and it's sort of like it's almost like a joke in product design. It's like, well, what's the most efficient use of material? It's like, well, not making something at all, but that's really not an option when we're trying to solve some real human problem. I think the best thing we can do is try to look at our projects that are coming through and what it is we're passionate about working on, and look for ways to align to those values. And that's something I've always tried to hold in focus. And I'm just grateful that, part of my work lately has been looking at how can we create a toolkit for digital sustainability. So what is the energy efficiency? How can we measure the carbon of the emissions of what we're doing? And it seems like it could be paltry, but it ends up being quite a significant amount. It's about 4% of our global emissions is just from all our digital stuff.
Okay.
And so we have started to pay close attention to what can we do to mitigate some of that as we're designing our new experiences.
And are you finding that, so you're talking about, the products and services that you're working on, and these are clients that you're working with to build out these services and products? And is that a conversation point that they are connecting to? Do they all understand kind of the new, like, I won't say new way, but the idea of sustainable design? I haven't heard a ton of before, I guess, the last few years.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's sort of like, I think of it as in the the early 2000s, there was a big push for how can we think about accessible design, and what are things that we can do to make our web pages more accessible on the internet. And this wasn't always something that clients would ask for, but it's something that has become commonplace today, fast forward to today. And it's just something we do by default. It's not something that somebody has to ask for. And if we excluded it, they'd be like, what happened? Why doesn't our website work? Why aren't we getting search results? It's like, well, you didn't pass your accessibility targets. It's like, well, why didn't we? You should have just done that. And I think sustainability will have a moment like that where clients may not be asking for it, but it's going to become commonplace as companies are expected to not only make ESG or sustainability commitments, but to follow through with them. And I think this is one way that they can follow through and kind of live live by example.
It'll become table stakes, basically.
It'll become table stakes someday. But we're not there yet.
No. Yeah. So how much of your time do you spend actually educating them, or kind of like telling them what they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, this is a tale as old as time, right? We've been I feel like that education component has been something that I've seen happening in the market ever since I, got to start working with clients and thinking about these things. And so it's been, about 15 years of, how do you start with education? How do you think about these things? And I think it's finally to a place where when you look at where Europe is compared to America, the policies have been in place since about 2005 there, where they've been regulating things like e-waste, things like digital emissions, have all been done there for a long time. And we're starting to see more opportunity for that in America when we look at like the Inflation Recovery Act. Just opportunities for electrification are huge compared to what this is the biggest shift we've seen in nearly 20 years of sort of the green movement. So, I'm hopeful and optimistic that this will become that commonplace thing that we were talking about.
Yeah. And I'm going to go kind of back in history a little bit, because you've been talking about, conversations you've been having, but you started out after college at Apple. And so when we think of a company where it's design, like user-centered design and designer-led, how did that impact working there your trajectory?
Yeah, I'm grateful for this start I had. I went to school at Carnegie Mellon and was working in a lab where it was a product innovation lab. So it was engineers, designers, MBAs working on sort of the next generation of products and services. And one of our clients was Apple, and I was fortunate enough to work on what became Numbers. Was the very start I had, and that's what brought me out to the Bay Area, and I've been here pretty much ever since.
Yeah.
But I think the lessons that I learned there were really craft related, in sort of like, what does it mean to be a craftsman of that's really living and breathing the details, and not just like, what does it mean to make beautiful pixel perfect artwork, but actually thinking about those human-centered problems. And how does that translate into an experience that is just like uncompromisingly good. And there's good habits and bad habits I learned there, right? I think the good habits are that attention to detail and those sort of craft first movement. I mean, there are a few better companies that we can look at today where you can say, like, what is the value of design? You can very easily point to Apple and be like, well, that's what can happen if you truly care about your customer, about solving problems that you live yourself firsthand. I think that's really kind of the core tenet that I learned there. So, and then, like, what is the other side of that coin? It's like, well, I realize not every business can wait to launch something until it is truly perfect, right? Sometimes getting it out stealthily and testing in the background versus just launching it and starting to iterate, there's sort of a balancing act. And I think that's something that, every business and every company at their various stages has to decide for themselves. So I've worked at very big companies like Apple, and now, very entrepreneurial businesses. And it's sort of, that's just the stakes of trying to launch early and launch often.
But it's an interesting place to be, like the Bay Area, related to all this, like the whole fail fast movement, things like that. And so you brought up Apple as an example. Are there what other companies do you kind of look at and think, man, they are crushing it with design?
I am a Tesla fanboy, and I think you can feel that the people who build that product love that product. Like, when I think about, like, what do I appreciate about design, it's like when you see little details in something that you use every day or use frequently, and you see that, like, something's there that, like, probably wouldn't be there if someone just wasn't using it every day. I think I really appreciate seeing that out in the world. And I think the Tesla is an example of that. Just like, I don't know, what is it like? Just even being able to schedule when I want it to charge is like fun to me. Or seeing my app and, like, being able to interact with my car the way I interact with, like, my text messages is like, it's cool. I just like that.
Well, I mean, and in that case, we're talking about design across different use cases or ways of using, right? Like, obviously the car itself, you like the design, but the ability to engage with it from a digital experience also. Fascinating.
And by the way, I feel like such a sellout saying Tesla, because I would much rather, it's kind of like when someone's like, oh, what are you listening to right now? Like, I want to be able to say the name of a band that you're like, oh, I've never heard of them. It's like, yeah, I've been listening to them forever. But instead I said Tesla, you're like, oh, you listen to Taylor Swift? Cool.
Yeah.
It's like, that's like, that's not cool to say for an old dude.
Well, I did have a friend recently buy a Tesla, and he loves it, but he also hates the idea that him and everybody, basically, so many people drive Teslas here, right? But it's an amazing product. They're basically not first to market per se, but first to, I would say, mass adoption from an electric car standpoint compared to some of the other ones. But I think that also checks your box around sustainable design. Like, we're not that because I didn't say sustainable design. I just said design.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it's true. I wanted to bring it back to an example like that as well. And it's sort of like, it certainly is. It's like, why can't sustainability be sexy too? Like, we don't want to have to think about, like I talk about, like, sustainability doesn't have to mean it's like this granola hippie vibe. Like, I'm sitting here in Birkenstocks trying to convince you that, like, oh no, this is cool and sexy design. It's like, no, you wouldn't believe me if I was pushing that. No hate on Birkenstocks, by the way.
Yes.
But it's like, what is it that we could do to make sustainability sort of commonplace, right? It shouldn't have to be something that has stylistic implications or political implications. It should just be part of the process and the experience. So yeah, that's sort of, I think, part of the value of that. Hopefully where that example leads us, right? It's like Tesla isn't a cool electric car; it's just a cool car.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and it's also speeding up, I feel like, other adjacent industries that Tesla affects, right? Like they'll having a smart grid, even, right? And so people are having to think through. I would say what's the next step to make it so, like, if all of us drove electric cars, even, right? Do you think about like the design from that perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a critical question of like, what is that whole collective experience of what is that electrification movement really going to mean for us at our homes, at our businesses? And I know there's a big focus on California of like, oh man, if everybody plugged in their cars, we'd be drawing like a whole other home's worth of energy. But it's interesting. I mean, the data isn't quite like panning out there. It's only ends up being about like 3% of our energy during peak load time is only because of vehicles. And California is one of the most wired from an EV standpoint states right now. So we're not having a lot of trouble keeping up with demand. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't plan for the future and think about how do we load balance when people, everybody gets home from work, wants to plug in, get ready for work the next day, and like all of a sudden, we have brownouts or something. Like, yes, of course, that's a terrible scenario we don't want to have happen.
Right.
But it hasn't panned out that we're in jeopardy of that yet.
Right. It'll be interesting to see what happens if we do get to that point.
Good problems to have,
Yeah. I mean, we have smart people thinking about them, right? Like, I'm guessing
we're trying.
Yeah. What other areas do you see sustainable design?
I think that the home is a great one. Like everybody's home being fully electrified, not just the technology is finally as good as it's ever been. I think it's, all of the pieces are there. The ability to electrify has never been easier. The government's even subsidizing it. So what is that last barrier? It's really paying for it. It still remains that sort of like, how do we get everybody to be able to afford these upgrades in a sort of wartime effort? It's like, we need to deploy this as fast as possible. And I'm not just talking about like government handouts, but really like, how do we make it as easy as possible to get, green mortgages on our infrastructure, and how do we incentivize landlords to add that to business, commercial spaces and multifamilies as well as just single family homes. Like, it shouldn't just be the wealthy that get to have clean air and low electric bills.
And obviously this is kind of a US centric conversation in that way. Are you also seeing sustainable design in other markets, and maybe the same way, but also other ways?
I mean, I think in Europe too. I mean, in certainly Asian countries, I think the idea of like heat pumps have been around for a lot longer, but also their environmental sort of like their climate differences have been as challenging as the U.S. Like having winters and cold winters and hot summers for a heat pump has always been challenging when we think about how do we electrify our heating and cooling and water heating and all that stuff.
Let's talk about somebody who's interested in getting into this space, right? Whether they are a college student who's graduating, or maybe just somebody looking to pivot in their role, and they're fascinated and passionate about this. I know you've kind of done some research. You've shared some thoughts before. What are some tips that you would give to somebody who's?
Yeah, I think it's a great one, and I like to. I get that question a lot, and I try to think of it as like, what did I want to know 2 years ago that I know now? And I think there's sort of that idea of, I get a lot of inbounds from recent graduates, in particular, around, how do you find a job that is sustainable? And there aren't a lot of like jobs that have the word sustainability in the title for designers, but I don't think that means we shouldn't apply to them. Like, recent grads like should certainly look for those jobs and look for ways to start building sustainability into the roles that they have. So if you're already in a job, there is a way to make that job sustainable. You just have to look for it. And I think thinking about the impact of the work you do, of the decisions you make day in and day out, and looking at the sustainability commitments of the company you're already in. So I think, we have to totally electrify our grid and decarbonize. And every company, every decision we make, every action we have, whether we're at work or at home, like feeds that impact. So I'd say the job you're in is a sustainable job, for everyone. Yep. And what are those things we can do? And one of the best resources I've seen is Paul Hawkins' Drawdown is a great one. that looks at some of the frameworks for where is the impact the largest. So how do we think about where do we want to try and focus our efforts, and what are the actions we can do?
Well, let's. Time is winding down.
You want me to do the Attia thing or just
yeah, do the, because we can still use that.
I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, please.
It's sustainably.
Yes, I mean he is all about sustainable, like
Health.
Yeah,
Sure.
long living,
Longevity. So the Peter Attia Centurion Decathlon is the idea of what do you want your last decade to be like, and the idea being if that last decade is awesome and you're not like sick and in the hospital and hooked up to all sorts of stuff and bedridden, but you're out having a great time, that the other decades would have been awesome too.
Right.
And you've always been my fitness guru. Hashtag body by Hayats.
Consistency.
Yeah, consistency. In all things, right?
Yeah.
In health, in work, that idea of consistency is huge. So I wonder if you had ever given thought of what do you want that Centurion Decathlon to be for you? Because I'm looking for just in like with our workouts, like what are those pointers you have? Because I'm trying to make that. I like that premise, and I want it for myself.
Right.
So I want to know if you've thought of that.
So I haven't thought about it from that perspective, but I have thought about it how as I age, certain things become more important in terms of health and well-being and just wellness, I would say. And so I know like that in my 30s, I was able to do a certain amount of things without worrying about like the ramifications necessarily, right? Like if I could go and just do a race or something and it would be painful, but it'd be fine. In your 40s, you start realizing, the muscle memory is kind of there, but also if you don't continue working on it, and I'm not trying to do the big things anymore. I'm comfortable and I'm happy looking at my last decade. When I turn 50, if I look back on my last decade, that I stayed fit and healthy. And I think the purpose also changes, right? So in my 40s, like if you have a family, right, you want to stay fit for not just yourself anymore. You want to be able to be there for your kids and your grandkids and things like that. So I think the idea changed a little bit, but the fact that I've consistently focused on being healthy living, having a healthy lifestyle, that's money in the bank.
And I think there's those qualitative metrics of like, I want to be able to keep up with, the kids and the grandkids, like awesome, right? And like be mobile, like get all those things. What about quantitative ideas? Like you were talking about VO2 max, like what do those numbers look like? Have you talked to any friends about like, well, what does that trend line look like as you go decades and decades out?
Right. Well, it's hard. It's from that perspective, you can look at like what your VO2 max is, what the 95th percentile is for somebody who's my age, right? So that is kind of the benchmark, but I can't compare it to 35-year-old John's VO2 max. Like from an HRV perspective, I've noticed that there's a precipitous drop off as you age. And so even if I was as fit as I could ever be, that number would still be lower than 30-year-old John, right? So I keep track of some of that data. More than anything, though, the from a quantitative standpoint, I keep track of my sleep. Right? I think everybody has realized the importance of sleep and just making sure that I get a quality night, even if it's not quality, I at least try. So consistency around like bedtime, and also from the perspective that affects other areas of your life, right? Like if I go out drinking or something like that, I know that that's going to affect my sleep.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because it's completely in your control. Whereas the other things like VO2 max are not, right? I mean, they're somewhat in your control, but not in a like strictly like speaking wise. Like you can control that you're probably going to be able to sleep in 7 hours, but yeah.
And my VO2 max is not going to fluctuate that much over like the next decade, I would say.
Okay.
I think it'll drop, but my sleep should stay consistent. That is all the time we have. Any final words that you'd love to share just about design, I guess? This is Global Design Talk. So.
It's a Global Design Talk. I mean, design is in everything we do. So whether we're talking about sustainability, automotive, our homes, or even our own bodies, like we can have lifestyle design of ourselves. And that's why I appreciate you talking through this provocation of the even the Centurion Decathlon. So I mean, it's all related and it's all fun, and it's all interesting, and I think will keep us young just to keep thinking about these things and solving problems every day of our lives. So appreciate you making the time to just chat about these things and having me in your inaugural pod.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for joining us. It was a breath of fresh air learning about not only how you went from being at Carnegie Mellon to Apple to what you're doing now, and incorporating sustainable design and kind of educating folks and just being great all around.
Thanks for having me, John.
All right. Take care, man.
Oh. Yeah.